Today we will speak about the introduction to the Pentateuch in general, and especially introduction to the book of Genesis. And I need to tell you that actually rabbis considered Pentateuch as the most authoritative part of the scripture. So do remember that they divided all the scripture on three parts: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So Torah was the most authoritative part of the scripture. And it is clear even from the fact that in the synagogue, they divided Torah on special divisions, on special parts, and every Sabbath they read a portion from the Pentateuch for the congregation. And this practice was widespread almost in all synagogues. And it says that actually Torah was considered as the most important part of the scripture by the rabbis. It's an interesting story that during the Maccabean War, or even before the Maccabean War, Antiochus Epiphanes prohibited Torah and reading the Torah and everything related to this. And the rabbis also divided the historical books or former prophets, or they call it Nevi'im, the parts of Nevi'im, the prophetic parts of the Bible.
Excuse me, Prof.
Yes.
I don't know if what you are talking, you are sliding them. I just see only Pentateuch and introduction.
Yes, yes. It is just a story behind. So
right.
You don't need to memorize it. It is just like a story behind the slide, yeah. I don't have it on slides. And so the rabbis also divided the Nevi'im section into the weekly parts, and they also added readings of the Nevi'im to the readings of Torah in the synagogues. But this sequence says that actually they understand that Torah is the most important part. The Nevi'im is the next important part, and Ketuvim is the last part, which is also important, but not as important as Torah and as important as Nevi'im. And when we speak about the Pentateuch, so we need to tell that from the very beginning, we can see that the Pentateuch was always considered as one book. Authors of the Old Testament refer to the Pentateuch as one book. So they never divided book on Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and so on. And it's also interesting that the authors of the New Testament also considered Pentateuch as one book. Like, for example, Mark 12:26 says, Book of Moses. But there is a question. So when was Pentateuch divided into 5 books? And definitely it took place before the Common Era. And we know that the term Pentateuch was already known since the time of Josephus. Sorry, there is a mistake here. And Philo, I don't remember which is correct. So it means already before the birth of Christ, the term Pentateuch was already known to the people. And we can assume, and this assumption, I think it is true, that actually the division into the books happened when the Pentateuch was translated into Greek language. So when it was translated into the Greek language, it was divided on several books. But even the division between the books sometimes looks a little bit artificial, and we will see it a little bit later. And the Pentateuch was divided into 5 books, most probably because of the convenience. As you know, usually one book was placed on one scroll. So one scroll contained one book of the Bible. and it was very difficult to have all Pentateuch in one scroll, so the scroll would be very, very long. So in this case, just for convenience, they divided the books into several, the Pentateuch into several sections, as we have it now, like 5 books of Moses. And we can see that the Pentateuch has common theme and plot, like each book is connected to each other. Each book continues the plot of the previous one. So that is why we can see that the Pentateuch is very difficult to divide. As yesterday we spoke about the critical scholars who tried to find some sources, original sources, from which the final composition was comprised. But in fact, it is very difficult to do because every book has very tight connections with other books. Just for example, what we can see, this is the structure of the part, and you can see this structure can show us that actually the division sometimes is a little bit artificial. For example, what connects everything together? Exodus from 1 to 18, this part speaks about what happened from Egypt to Sinai, so how people of God came to Sinai. After that, we have a very, very long passage, and from Exodus 19 and up to Numbers 10:10, we can see that people of God, Israelites, were stationed at Sinai. And only in Numbers 10:11, they left Sinai and they started the journey in the wilderness. But until that time, they're still at Sinai. So do you see the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers connected by this one place where the events took place? From Numbers till the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we can see that people are traveling in the wilderness, and they came to the plains of Moab. And also what we can say, speak about the unity of the Pentateuch, we can say that the person of Moses unites many sections of the Pentateuch so that it is like one composition. Because Moses is presented as the second Adam, because he saw God face to face. Moses is presented as the second Noah, and it's very clear from the second chapter of the book of Exodus, where Moses is saved in the basket. And what is very interesting, that the word for the basket is the same word as the word for the ark of Noah. And so Moses is presented as the second Noah. And Moses is also presented as the second Abraham. Both are given the promise of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. Moses, as Abraham, blessed the following generations, and so on and so forth. So we can say that Moses is like a key person or key hero of the book that connects all the passages or all the parts of the book together. And we can see these connections between different characters of the book. And also, as I already mentioned, the division between books are a little bit artificial. For example, the division between Exodus and Leviticus. What we can see, the book of Leviticus starts with the Vaiktol form, Vaikra Adonai, when God called from the tabernacle to Moses. And this beginning Vaikra, it means like a continuation, because it started with the conjunction Vav. It is like a continuation of the previous narrative. And when we read the end of the Exodus, book of Exodus, we can see that actually this division is artificial, because the narrative continues from the book of Exodus to the book of Leviticus. In the book of Exodus, we can see that it is finished when the glory of God came upon the tabernacle, and God's visible presence was in the tabernacle. And the book of Leviticus starts when God speaks from the tabernacle. So do you see this division is a little bit artificial? And the same we can see about the division between the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers. So we can see that, as I told you already, everything is still at Mount Sinai. So people do not move from the Mount Sinai. So it looks like it is the same event. And the same we can say about the book of Numbers. So because the people of Israel came to the plain of Moab a little bit earlier, so they came in the end of the book of Numbers. But of course, the book of Deuteronomy has its particular genre, and that is why it was singled out as a separate book. But the unity of the place, so the same place, the events described in those books are happening at the same place. So we can see that the end and the beginning of each book are closely related to each other. And one more very interesting feature, and I took this information from the book of Sailhammer, John Sailhammer, The Pentateuch as Narrative, the book that I would like to recommend you to read. That author in the entire Pentateuch uses a very interesting sequence of arranging the material. So there is a narrative, and after this narrative we can have a piece of poetry, and after this piece of poetry we have an epilogue, and after that everything is repeated again. So let us consider several examples that we can see that it really works in Pentateuch, in the Pentateuch, especially in the book of Genesis. For example, the first section is narrative, Genesis chapter 1 to 2, and it describes how everything was created. And after that, we have the first poetry in the Bible. And this first poetry in the Bible is the Song of Adam when he saw Eve. And after that, we have a very short epilogue, like a conclusion, that the serpent was the most, was a very cunning creature, and so on and so forth. After that, we have Genesis 3. It is a full narrative. And again, we have a poetry. And the poetry is about the destiny of serpent, the destiny of woman, the destiny of man. And after that, we have again a short epilogue when Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. And again, we have a narrative, Cain's descendants. And in the end of the narrative, again, we have a Song of Lamech, a Lamech song. And after that, again, we have a short epilogue in the end of chapter 4. And everything is repeated again. Like we have, for example, Joseph's story. After that, Jacob's blessing, and Jacob's blessing also is given as a part of the, as a poetry. And Genesis 50 functions as the epilogue to all this story. Of course, we can see that this pattern is not consistent. For example, some parts are missing, like the story of Abraham, Isaac are not there. But what we can see, this is the pattern that the author tries to follow throughout the Pentateuch. Like, for example, later on we can see Exodus from Egypt, and Exodus 15, we have Song of Moses as the end of this. And Exodus 15:26 could be considered as the epilogue. And the big narrative from Exodus 15 until Numbers 22, and we have Balaam's blessing, and Balaam's blessing is also given as a poetry. But this pattern can tell us again about the unity of the Pentateuch. So it is impossible to divide the book, the Pentateuch, on different sources, because in this case, this pattern, which is clearly visible here, doesn't make sense. It is just we cannot explain this interesting feature if we divide the book on different parts. Okay, is it clear so far? Now let us go to the structure of the Pentateuch, and the structure of the Pentateuch is very simple. You can find it almost in every textbook on the Pentateuch. And usually the scholars divide the Pentateuch on several parts, like primeval history, it is chapters Genesis 1 to 11, stories of patriarchs, chapters 12 to 50, Exodus from Egypt, from 1 to 18, at Sinai, from Exodus 19 to Numbers 10:10, from Sinai to Moab, the rest of the book of Numbers, and repetition of the law to a new generation, and this is the book of Deuteronomy. So this is the structure of the Pentateuch. Yes, and now I would like to speak about another important topic or another important issue in the Pentateuch, and this is the theme of the Pentateuch. And do you see this issue about the theme of the Pentateuch is a very, I don't want to say debatable issue, but very important issue, because scholars try to find, can we find one topic or one theme that would run from the beginning of the Pentateuch to the very end of the Pentateuch, and that can unite all the content of the Pentateuch together. And before we go to the next slide, I would like just to ask you, can you please think and suggest what would you propose as the main theme of the Pentateuch? That theme that could include almost everything that is written in the Pentateuch and explain everything that is in the Pentateuch.
Professor?
Yes, please.
I'm just speaking about what Pastor Stephen Bohr has given in terms of the keys of Genesis. And I think that not only applies to Genesis, but it also applies to the other books of the Pentateuch, as far as I know. And that is that the first books of the Bible is the blueprint, the index to what would happen to between God and civilization over the next thousands of years. That it becomes like an index, because every story given there is a typology that in a bigger way finds its way in the end. For instance, Cain and Abel represents two classes in the end. The beginning of Genesis is the creation. The end of Revelation is the back to chaos. The tabernacle representing Jesus. So I think that it is a blueprint that we can look back at the Old Testament and can say God knew the end from the beginning. So I would say, if I would say it's a theme, then I would say the theme is God knows the end from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, interesting. But do you see, you try to go outside the Pentateuch?
I understand. Yes. Yeah.
But the idea is brilliant. Is very good idea. Yeah. Thank you very much for bringing it to the class. It's really true, and we'll speak about it a little bit later, that even in the Pentateuch, even without going outside, we can find many issues in many cases when somebody in the beginning of the Pentateuch functions as a type, for the event that is described a little bit later in the Pentateuch. Like, for example, Adam and Noah. There are some connections between them and some other issues as well. We will see. Abraham and Moses as well. Not Abraham and Moses, but Sinai covenant and Abrahamic covenant. We can find some parallels here. Okay, anybody? Thank you very much, Pastor Deon. Anything else? Just, it is not for grade. Just speak.
Yes, Prof. My thinking was, I mean, this is maybe a knee-jerk reaction, but a theme that I think keeps on coming out is covenant. God making a covenant with his people. So we see this, for example, God creates a perfect world, man sins, and it's almost like God, when he pronounces the punishment or the punishments upon the serpent, the woman, and on Adam, it's almost like he makes a covenant with them, because there's the promise of the crushing of the head of the serpent. And even though it is a sentence to the serpent, but it comes across also as a promise and a ray of hope for Adam and Eve. And then you have the killing of the lamb. Then you have Noah, the destruction of the world, and then God making a covenant with Noah. And then you have the calling out of Abraham and God making a covenant with Abraham. And then you have the calling out of the children of Israel from Egypt, and then God making a covenant with them. And so it seems like the theme of covenant keeps on reoccurring in the books of the Pentateuch and in the whole narrative. And it's like the book of Deuteronomy now gives us a full scale of the conditions of the covenant, maintaining the covenant with God.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very good idea. I like it very much. And it is true that the covenant is like one of the key themes in the book of Pentateuch. I completely agree with this. And I would like to add even something more. It seems to me you don't have a class on the theology of the Old Testament, or you do. I don't remember. Do you have in your curriculum this class on the theology of the Old Testament? But do you see it is also one of the key issues about is it possible to find one theme in the entire Old Testament, one unifying theme in the entire Old Testament? And actually, there is a very nice book written by our Adventist scholar, Gerhard Hassel. And this book became like, he is known outside Adventism mostly because of this book. And in this book, he tried to discuss how to make a theology of the Old Testament. And one of the, so he classifies, it seems to me, 10 different approaches to make the theology of the Old Testament. And one of this approach was to find a key theme in the Old Testament. And probably one of the first person who tried to do this was German scholar Walter Eichrodt, and he wrote a 2-volume book, very thick book on the theology of the Old Testament. And he suggested that the theme of the covenant is the main theme of the Old Testament. So it's not only the book of Genesis, but the entire Old Testament. Of course, somebody can agree with this, somebody cannot agree with this. We don't go to this direction. But I like very much the idea that Pastor Poswa has suggested. Anybody else?
Yes,
please.
Let me suggest that one theme should be promises. God fulfills his promises.
Very nice. Very nice idea. Yes, Pastor Aaron, very nice. You came very close to the also very important work on the Pentateuch, written about like 30 or even more, like 40 years ago by English scholar, and this English scholar is David Kleins. And it seems to me he wrote a dissertation on this topic, and later on it was published as a book. and the book was called The Theme of the Pentateuch. And I will read what he wrote in his book, and I would like to pay your attention to this because it could be in the questionnaire, I mean in the quiz. And he says like this, so this is his main thesis of his book. The theme of the Pentateuch is the partial fulfillment, which implies also the partial non-fulfillment of the promise to or blessings of the patriarchs. The promise of blessing is both the divine initiative in a world where human initiatives always lead to disaster and are an affirmation of the primal divine intentions for humanity. The promise has three elements: posterity, divine-human relationship, and the land. And the posterity element of the promise is dominant in Genesis, the relationship element in Exodus and Leviticus, and the land element in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Pastor Aaron was very, very close to his definition when he says about the promise. The main theme of the Pentateuch is the partial fulfillment and also partial non-fulfillment of the promise and promises related to the blessings of the patriarchs. So this was the definition or understanding of the theme, main theme of the Pentateuch. And in fact, it's really true, and it is also related to the covenant issue, because covenant, the blessings or the promises is the part of the covenant. So they are very, very closely related. And look, in the very beginning, God blessed Adam and Eve. And the blessings or promise was that they should multiply and they should rule the world or have rule over the land. Yes, and it's very interesting that these elements are coming throughout Pentateuch. So later on, this is element of posterity. When, for example, in Genesis 3:15, it says about the seed that will finally destroy, the seed of woman will destroy the seed of the serpent. And the promises of land is also very important. And of course, the promise of relationship. But what is also important, that some of these elements are fulfilled. For example, the posterity element. Already in the book of Exodus, we can see that the people of Israel are becoming a multiple nation with many, many people. But the promise of land has not been fulfilled in the Pentateuch. So that is why Kleins says it is partial fulfillment and partial non-fulfillment of the promises. And the promises have three elements: posterity, divine-human relationship, and the land. Okay, Pastor Poswa, I can see you raised up a hand, please.
Yes, so can we say from this theme that the partial fulfillment is because of the faithfulness of God, and the partial non-fulfillment is caused by the unfaithfulness or inability of man to fulfill his part in the covenant?
Yes, and do you see what he says? That sometimes individuals try to fulfill these promises by their own efforts, but it will inevitably lead to a disaster. Like, for example, Abraham tries to do it by himself, but it ends with a disaster. And I do remember in Numbers 14, after the rebellion of the spies, when people tried to enter the promised land and to conquer it without God, it ends up with a disaster. So it always, human initiative always lead to the disaster. Yeah, Pastor Londiela, I can see your hand is up.
Yes, Prof. About the theme of the Pentateuch, can we suggest also that an important feature of the Pentateuch also is the Torah, which I mean the instructions, because I think that it is the mean by which those three elements are fulfilled. Yeah, that's my suggestion.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you mean this Torah as a law? Yes, did I understand you correct?
Yes, Prof. I don't say that. I don't know if we can say it, if we can consider it as a theme, but I think it is maybe God gave the law, the instructions
Legislations.
as a mean in order to fulfill those three elements that are mentioned here.
Yeah, we can say like this. So it is like a way how these elements should be fulfilled. The promises should be fulfilled. Yes. But I also would like to add something, and it seems to me it is important, that actually in ancient times, people usually, even rabbis, they do not usually divide. So it was Torah, everything was Torah, and Torah is a law. So it means that they didn't say that the story of Abraham is a narrative. It is also part of the law. So that is why when Apostle Paul speaks about the law, there are many questions about what does he mean when he says a law. The law is just legislation like 10 Commandments and something else, or it is just everything. But of course, it is another topic, so we don't go to this topic. Thank you very much, Pastor Landiello, for your comments. Pastor Deon, I see your hands is raised up. So, do you want to add anything else?
Yes, please, Professor. So, can we then say, based on this definition, that the summary of the Torah is concluded in Deuteronomy 28 to 30, because it seems that Deuteronomy 28 to 30 deals specifically with what we see in this definition?
Do you see? I wouldn't say like this, because. But I have my own idea about the Deuteronomy and the covenant of Deuteronomy. So I wouldn't say that the Deuteronomy is just a summary of everything that is written in the Torah. But let us come to this question, and I would like to ask you, please do not forget it, and let us come to this question again in the end of our class, when we will discuss the book of Deuteronomy in general, and we will see how it is related to the previous narrative. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anything else, or we can just proceed? Okay, let's go ahead.
Mister?
Yes.
I have a new suggestion about I thought maybe it can be a theme. The shadow of the shadow of revelation, whereby all of the nations and what was contained these books, they were representing Christ himself. And in the New Testament is where now is revealed to the world.
Okay, can you repeat again your main idea?
My main idea is the shadow of revelation.
Oh, the shadow of the revelation.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, actually, it is related to what Pastor Deon said a little bit earlier, that everything is like a foreshadow or something that is supposed to happen later on. in the Bible. Yeah, it's true. Okay, so now we have 11, and let us make a short break, and let us come back at 11:10, if you don't mind. Okay, so let us come back at 11:10. So let us continue.
Yes.
And now, just we finished with a general introduction to the book, to the Pentateuch in general. And now we will move to the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, and today, during the next hour, we will speak about just an introduction to the book of Genesis. And after that, we will start studying the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And first of all, I would like to speak about the key text in the book of Genesis. So this key text is also like a unifying idea that can explain almost everything that is written in the book afterwards. And of course, we can find many candidates for this key text, but probably the best one would be Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offsprings and her offsprings. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Actually, do you see what is predicted here is the enmity between you, it means serpent, and the woman, and between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. So, and this is a very, very interesting idea. And what we can see in the rest of the book of Genesis, that the book of Genesis is built upon the enmity, is constructed upon the enmity. So we can see that the enmity is going throughout the book. For example, in the 3:15, it says about the enmity. In the next chapter, chapter 4, we can see that this enmity is going on between two brothers, Abel and Cain. Later on, we can see the same enmity also inside one family, like Esau and Jacob, Isaac and Ishmael. And after that, we can see that the same enmity happens among the sons of Jacob. So they have like an enmity among each other. So we can see that this idea of enmity is one also of the key ideas or key themes or topics in the book of Genesis. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. And according to this prediction of Genesis 3:15, it means that somebody is an offspring of woman and another is an offspring of a serpent, like for example, Cain and Abel. So Cain is a representative of those people who rebelled against God, and Abel, we know from the book of Hebrews, he is the one who follows God. And Jacob and Esau, the same. But of course, what I would like to say, do you see, the people can still change the camp. So, for example, Joseph and his brothers, we cannot say like Joseph is good and all his brothers are bad. Actually, they did a very, very bad actions. But finally, we can see that the kind of reconciliation happens and brothers came back to Joseph, and we cannot say, they changed. And so they stopped being the offsprings of serpent, but they became, they change. But what I would like to emphasize that this enmity is very important in the book of Genesis. And this enmity is going on around the question. So the main question of the fabula, of the plot of the book of Genesis is who will inherit the promised blessing. So what does it mean? In the very beginning, so it is clear, like Cain and so Adam and Eve have 3 children, like Cain, Abel, and later on Seth. But Cain killed Abel, so Cain cannot inherit the promise. And Abel is killed. He also cannot inherit the promise. So we have the 3rd son who is a heir of the promise. And later on, we can see in chapter 5 of the book of Genesis, we can see the genealogy, and this genealogy tells us about this line of inheritance. And it came to Noah, and again there is a question. Noah has 3 sons who will inherit the promise. And after that, the same question we can ask when Abraham cannot have children, and the main question is how the promise of the seed will continue through Abraham. And again, do you see this dilemma when he had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and God clearly says that Ishmael will not inherit the promise, but Isaac will inherit. Isaac also has 2 sons, and again there is a question. And when Jacob has 12 sons, this question is raised up again. Who will inherit the promise? Or through whom this line of Messiah, who is supposed to defeat Satan, will go? So this is one of the main questions of the book of Genesis. Who will be an heir of the promise? And what is also important, the promise in the book of Genesis is very often endangered. So what it means, many wives of patriarchs cannot have children. Like Sarah is barren, Rebecca couldn't have children, and Rachel also couldn't have children in the beginning. And we can see that Abraham, among them, Abraham was the one who tried to somehow to help God to fulfill the promise. But we can see that it didn't work. So it shows that the fulfillment of this promise is impossible by human efforts, but only God makes sure that it is fulfilled. So the promise is endangered because women cannot have children, but God intervenes in a period of time, in a moment of time, and he pushed this promise to be fulfilled. Also, why the promise is endangered? Because sometimes the patriarchs made some, from our perspective, is very stupid things. Like, for example, Abraham 2 times presented his wife Sarah as his sister, one time to Pharaoh and another time to Abimelech. It's very interesting that Isaac did the same. And we can see that only all this situation were a danger for the promise, because God promised Abraham that through him this line will go on. But when Abraham compromised his situation in this case, so it is evident that if it happened and Sarah became a wife of Pharaoh, so she would not be able to be the mother of the next heir of the promise. And in all this situation, God intervenes in order to save the situation. And now let us come to the very, very interesting and important topic. And this topic is the genre of the book of Genesis. And maybe you're already familiar with this idea. And I would like also ask you a question. So what do you think? What is the genre of the book of Genesis? How can you classify the genre of the book of Genesis?
Please. I think it is the narrative book.
Narrative, very well. Yeah, good. Any other ideas? Pastor Poswa, I can see your hand is raised up.
I was going to say narrative as well.
Also narrative, yeah. Okay, very well.
But like you showed, there was a little bit of poetry
okay.
from the structure that you showed. But I think it's mainly narrative.
Okay, very well. Pastor Dion?
Professor, I'm not sure if this is a genre, but that it is a historical book rather than something like a myth or a saga.
Yeah, very well. Because do you see sometimes, especially critical scholars, they say that it is a kind of saga. And if it is a saga, it means that it is not historical. And if it is not historical, it means that it is like a legend or myth about Abraham, about Isaac, about some other patriarchs. So they didn't exist if it is saga. So we cannot say that it is saga. And it is true, it is historical, and it is a narrative, historical narrative. And we can say like this. Yes, it's good. Any other ideas? Okay. So if you don't have any other ideas, this information is actually very common, and you can find it almost in every book on Genesis. Scholars agree. Sometimes, very often, they do not agree, but in this case, they agree that the book of Genesis has a very specific, and I would say even not unique, but quite unique genre. And it is true that we can call it historical narrative, but they would like to say that the genre of the book of Genesis is genealogy or toledot. So toledot is the Hebrew word which comes from the root yalat, to give birth. And toledot, we can translate it as just a genealogy. So why do scholars say that this is the genre of the book? First of all, because this word toledot occurs very often in the book of Genesis. So there are 11 different toledots in the book of Genesis. Am I right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, sorry, 10. Okay, let it be 10. So 10 different toledots in the book of Genesis. Of course, not always the word toledot is translated in our Bible as toledot. Like, for example, in Genesis 5:1, it is translated in some Bible, it is translated like the book of origins, or the book, let me see. And you can also check in your Bible how it is translated. This is the document containing the family records of Adam in my Bible. And 6:9. These are the family records of Noah. So these translators of this Bible prefer to call it the book of records, of family records, like this. But in original, we can find that here is used the word toledot. Like this is the toledot of Adam. This is a toledot of Noah. This is a toledot of the sons of Noah in 10:1. 11, this is the toledot of Shem. 11:27, this is the toledot of Terah, the father of Abraham, and so on and so forth. So we can see that the Bible, the word toledot is used very often in the book of Genesis. But when we look at the structure of the genealogy, we can find a specific pattern, and this specific pattern is followed in in most of the cases. Let us look at Genesis 5. So what we have, the name of the patriarch, let me open it. I read from verse 3, chapter 5. Adam, so the name of the patriarch, lived or was 130 years when he fathered a son in his likeness according to his image, and named him Seth. So what happened afterwards? And he fathered other sons and daughters. So Adam's life lasted 930 years, then he died. So what we can see in this structure or in this pattern, that it is always repeated. Like Seth lived 105 years and he fathered Enosh. Seth lived 870 years after he fathered Enosh, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So Seth's life lasted 912 years, then he died. Enosh was 90 years old when he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived 815 years after he fathered Kenan, and he fathered other sons and daughters. So Enosh's lives lasted 905 years, then he died. So do you see, we have this specific pattern that is followed throughout chapter 5. But what is also interesting, it followed even later on. Look, chapter 5:32. 5:32. Noah was 500 years old, and he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And when we look at chapter 9 and verse 29, we can see like a continuation of this genealogy. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So it is exactly as we have on this previous slide. Like we have the first element of genealogy, and we have the last element, and we have something in between, And what happened between this verse and this verse? And what happened is the story of flood. So what we can see here, that actually we cannot say that this genealogy of Genesis 5 finished in the 5th chapter, but it continues later on, and the story of flood is just inserted in the genealogy of Noah. So do you see it? It looks like, as I said, that is why scholars say that the genre of the book of Genesis is genealogy. So what it means? That just a generation of people are mentioned. But when in the life of some of the people, some of the person, happens something interesting, something that is worthy of special attention, the author just explains it, but he inserted this description of what happened in the life of a certain person. He inserted this description in the genealogy. So we can say that this is just one genealogy, but it is just a story that happened in the time of Noah. So when we look at this slide, the patriarch lived and something happened during his life, and this is described here. And after that, the author comes to the end of this genealogy. So when we look at some other genealogies, we can see that it is repeated again. For example, the genealogy of Noah is finished, but now we have Genesis 10:1. These are the family records of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. So we have another genealogy, and it is described what happened during their lives. And after that, we have continuation of the genealogy, which goes through Shem to Abraham. So we can see that when one genealogy is finished, another genealogy is started. So that is why the scholars say that the genre of the book of Genesis is genealogy. So is it clear?
Yes.
Like, for example, we can see some other examples. The genealogy of Jacob, and this is genealogy of Joseph. These are the generations of Jacob, Joseph being 17 years old. After that, we have story of Joseph and the end of the book of Genesis. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So do you see, from the very beginning to the very end of the book of Genesis, it's like a continuation of different genealogies, and one genealogy smoothly is transferred to another genealogy. So the entire book of Genesis is genealogy. So is it clear? And why
Yeah, Prof.
genealogy is yes?
No, I was going to ask, so the narrative drives the genealogy, it's just the narratives in, they go between the genealogies.
Oh yeah,
But the story itself is driven by the genealogy.
We can say like this, yes. So the narrative is inserted in the genealogy, but the genealogy is like a frame of the entire narrative of the book of Genesis. Yeah, we can say like this. So Pastor Devon, I can see your hand is raised up.
Professor, why do you think that it was important to keep the ages? Was it to provide a chronology of when things happened, or is there another reason why these ages are specifically added?
Yes, it's a very good question. Thank you very much for this question. Of course, it is done with the purpose. It is done with the purpose so that we can know the exact, not exact, but we can know the time frame and how many years came from one period of time to another period of time. So this is important. But later on, we will come back to this question. And this question is not so easy as it seems to be. Why? Because we have a textual problem here. For example, if you look at the numbers in the Masoretic text, and if you look at the same numbers at the Septuagint, we will see the difference. So the Septuagint gives different years in the chapter 5 of the book of Genesis, and as well, it seems to me, in the chapter 5 and chapter 11. Yeah, chapter 11. It provides different time periods for the life of the patriarchs before the first son was born. And Samaritan Pentateuch also gives different time periods, slightly different from Masoretic text. And Josephus, in his book, also gives a little bit different time frame. And but Josephus mostly relied upon Septuagint. So because of this, it's very difficult to tell about the exact time period that lasted from, for example, the origin of the world, the creation of the world, until flood and until our time. And I think it is also on purpose. And let us speak about it a little bit later. It seems to me I have a slide, and on this slide I just show the difference between different genealogies in different sources. So let us come to this question a little bit later, okay? And now I would like to speak about the importance of the Toledot. Why is Toledot is important, or why did God put it in the form of Toledot? So what is the importance of this genre? And it is very much closely related to the key text. And do you remember that the key text is about the enmity, but not about the enmity, but about the seed, or about the descendants. So it means that this descendants, this line of the descendants of the seed of woman should not cease. It should continue through the ages, because Toledot should bring to the birth of the Messiah. So Messiah, eventually the Messiah should be born, should come through this Toledot. And that is why Toledot should never stop. And what is also important, the New Testament also starts with the Toledot. And it's very, very similar to Genesis 5. When Matthew starts the New Testament and his gospel, it starts with the book of records, or family records of Jesus. So it looks like it shows that, do you see, this Toledot eventually came to this climax, and Messiah came. So this is that is why Toledot is important. And I also would like to emphasize one more important issue when we speak about the Toledot. So when we look at chapter 4 of the book of Genesis, what we have here, I mean from verse 17, I will read it. Cain was intimate with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain became the builder of a city, and he named the city Enoch after his son. Irad was born to Enoch. Irad fathered Mehujael. Mehujael fathered Metushael, and Metushael fathered Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself, one named Ada and another named Zillah. Ada bore Jabal, he was the father of the nomadic herdsmen, and so on and so forth. So what do we have here? Is it a Toledot?
Genealogy.
Okay, genealogy, but is it a Toledot?
Professor, they start to speak about women instead of men. So Ada and Zillah are not men. So I would say no.
Very well, very well. Good observation. In fact,
It's not a Toledot.
yeah, correct. It's not a Toledot. And if we look at the first slide when I started speaking about the Toledot, so you cannot find Toledot in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. So this term, Toledot, is not mentioned in the chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. And it's very, very interesting issue. So do you see, Cain has descendants, but he doesn't have a Toledot. So Cain is not included into the Toledot. So he is away of the Toledot. And it means we can also say that the Toledot is a kind of a, it is related to the book of heavenly records, or the book that is mentioned in the book of Revelation, the book that only Jesus was worthy to open. And when we read later on Revelation 13 and verse 8, we can see that this is actually the book where the names of all saved people is written. So Toledot, also we can say that this is the book of those people who are saved, but Cain and his descendants are not in this book. Okay, any other questions about that? If you don't have questions, one more very interesting issue, and this is interesting issue is about unusual Toledot in the book of Genesis. And this unusual Toledot is mentioned in the book of Genesis, chapter 2 and verse 4. Can you please read it? This is the first Toledot.
I'm reading from the ISV.
Okay.
These are the records of the universe at its creation on the day that the Lord God made the heaven and the earth.
Mm-hmm. So this is the Toledot of whom or of what?
It says of the universe at its creation.
Universe. Okay, let's me just look at the original text, just to be precise here.
The King James says the generations of the heavens and of the earth.
Okay, very well, very well, very well. Just a minute, please. Yeah. Just remove one of the.
Prof,
Yes.
it says here, Eled Toledot Hashamayim Veha Aret.
Very well. Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is the Toledot of the heavens and the
Heavens
earth.
and the earth.
And the King James version is like more literal version. So they do not translate it differently, but they translate it as it is written, verbally written in the Bible. So, okay. So do you see? It is clear when the Bible speaks about the Toledot of the people, or genealogy of the people. But what does it mean when the Bible says about the Toledot of the heaven and the earth? Any ideas about that?
Pardon, Prof?
So what does it mean when the Bible says about the genealogy of the Toledot, of the heaven and the earth?
Professor, there's just a few things that now come to mind. In Matthew, we read, and he was a son of, and he was a son of, and later it was Adam was the son of God. So therefore,
it's not in Matthew, it's in Luke.
Or in Luke, yeah.
But it doesn't matter. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Good idea.
And then it also makes me think of in Job, where he talks about the sons of God, where maybe there was more than Earth, there was other planets also, where the sons of God came together.
Idea. Yes, a very good idea. Thank you very much for this. But okay, let me go back to the slides. Yeah, when we speak about this unusual Toledot, so let us remember the structure or the pattern of the Toledot. So do you see usually the name of the patriarch or name of something is mentioned, and after that this patriarch should die and somebody new, a new descendant should be born in the Toledot, in the pattern of Toledot. And if something interesting happened or something special happened in the life of this patriarch, so it is written in between the records of the patriarch and his when his son was born and the death of the patriarch. Okay, so in this case, let us think about this, about when this Toledot, this unusual Toledot comes to the end. The Toledot of heavens and earth.
I would venture that it ends in Jesus, because after that there was no more generations that were written up, Professor.
Maybe I don't agree with you here. But it's important, I would say that Jesus is the climax of the Toledot.
Doesn't it end with the creation of the new heavens and the new earth?
Okay, very well. Oh, it's the end of my presentation, so I forgot to insert one more slide. But if we open Revelation chapter 21, Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. So it looks like this is the end of this Toledot of heaven and earth. So do you see, this is the generation of the heaven, or Toledot of the heavens and the earth. And after that, we have the story, what happened. And in the end of the Bible, we have like a closed up formula. So I see new heaven and new earth. So new heaven and new earth appeared like a descendants of this old heaven and old earth. And after that, it is stated that the old heaven and old earth passed away. So they are no more. They are no more. So what does it mean? What is the significance of this pattern? It means that actually we can suggest that actually the entire Bible is a kind of a Toledot of heaven and earth, Toledot of our universe, Toledot of all the people who lived on our earth. So that is why pay attention to this very interesting detail. Do you see this Toledot sometimes appears in some books of the Bible, like for example the book of Ruth. It tells us a story of Ruth, but in the end we can see a part of the Toledot of David. And after that we have Toledot, or some Toledots in the book of Chronicles. Again some generations are mentioned. And sometimes it is, for us, it's very difficult to read them because we don't know their names. We don't know those people. Just only the names are mentioned in the Bible without any stories behind. So sometimes it's very difficult to read all those lists of the names. But this is important because this is a Toledot, which should bring finally to the birth of the Messiah. And what happened after the birth of the Messiah? So when the Messiah came to this world, so before this Toledot only comes through the Israelites. But when Messiah came to this world, what happened? He said about all people who believed in him, so everybody who believed in Jesus is now the seed of Abraham. So it looks like all of us are included into the Toledot of Abraham and Toledot of all the patriarchs. And we are part of this big Toledot. And finally, when the final stage of salvation is executed, so we can see that this Toledot is closed. And we have new heaven, new earth, and we have all the people who are saved. Yes, please, Pastor Deon.
Professor, I just want to add to that. I think that is also where the baptism comes in, to say that we are not born by blood, but born through the water and through the Spirit.
Yes.
So it is speaking about the generation, but it is not through blood anymore. It is through the baptism through choice and through the Holy Spirit.
Yes, correct. It's true, yeah. So we become born again, and to be born again, to be actually like Jesus, he is the Son of God, and we became also Son of God. So, and it is another very, very important issue, And I touched this issue in this devotion today, that the purpose of God is to restore us in our first condition. So we were sons of God, we were created in the image of God, and God wants to restore us into his image and likeness. Yes, Pastor Poswa.
Yeah, Prof, from what you just said, I'm now looking back at Revelation 20 before we get to Revelation 21, verse 1, which closes the Toledot, as you had said. And then it says here that, and whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So it's almost like these are the people who did not make it into the Toledot.
Yeah.
And so before the closing of the Toledot, they are excluded.
Thank you very much for the detail. Yeah.
So it's yeah, it's very, yeah. This, I don't know, this class has opened up a lot of things in yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this detail. I didn't notice it. Thank you. Thank you. It really helps to see the whole picture, the entire picture. Okay, any other questions about that? Oh, I see 2 hands are raised up. Or maybe you didn't load it. Pastor Poswa and Pastor Deon. Do you want to add anything, or it is just Pastor Landiela?
Yes, Professor.
Okay.
Pastor Landela, please continue.
Yeah.
I'm trying to grasp the meaning of the word, the term Toledot. So my question is, what is the, I think, if I may say, what is the nearest meaning of this word in English? Because when we say genealogy, for example, in this Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, it's not really a genealogy, because I think genealogy is a matter of people. So is there a more specific term for it in English, or we just keep the word Toledot?
Okay, yeah, thank you for this question. Thank you very much. So probably the best way to explain the word Toledot is to understand the etymology of the word. So Toledot comes from the root yalad, and yalad means to give birth. This is the Hebrew word. And actually Toledot is very much related to the genealogy. So genealogy is like Toledot is a list, or how to say, is a list of the descendants, we can say, yeah. But when it applies to the heaven and earth, it is quite unusual, because you are right. And that is why I said that it is a very, very unusual Toledot, because we do not expect heaven and earth to have some descendants. And in this case, and it's very, very important issue, and in its case, it is, we can say that it is a kind of personification of heaven and earth. So they are not alive, but it looks like they are alive. And one more thing that we need to remember in connection with this is the close relationship between Adam and earth, because Adam is made of earth, and when he dies, he came back to the earth, and it is like a destiny of every people here in this world. So we are born, but anyway, we need to come back to the earth. So in this case, this Toledot of heaven and earth, and we will speak about it just a little bit later today, how we can understand heaven and earth. What is the meaning of this phrase, heaven and earth? So it could be like the history of the entire humanity. So when God speaks about heaven and earth, of course, he doesn't speak about just something that is not alive, but he speaks about the generations of people. So it's a kind of personification of the entire history of the world.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. Any other things? Pastor Deon, do you want to say anything, or you just...
No,
Okay. So now we have almost 12, and we can make a break, and we can start a new topic just in a 10 minutes. Okay.
Thank you, Prof.
And when we speak about the structure of the book of Genesis, it's just like a reminder what we have spoken already. So we can divide the book of Genesis on two parts. The first 11 chapters scholars call primeval prologue. I don't know why they call it like this, but it is like an established title for this part of the book of Genesis. And the next part of the book of Genesis is called the stories of the patriarchs. And it is clear because starting from chapter 12, we have many stories of the patriarchs. Actually, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their families, and everything is rotated around their families. Okay, when we speak about the structure of this primeval prologue, we can say that it is a parallel structure. So what I mean? We can see like some events are parallel to other events that happened a little bit later. For example, creation, and God speaks to Adam. Flood, God speaks to Noah. Sons of Adam, sons of Noah. Development of the civilization and development of the civilization. 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and we have D is not very parallel, it's just a little bit swapped. And we have 10 generations from Noah to Terah, so it's also like parallel. And we have fall Nephilim, and we have also fall the Babylonian Tower. So, and it's clear that this is like a parallel structure. And this parallel structure can tell us a little bit about the purpose of God. So we can see that Noah is presented here as the second Adam. And later on, we'll speak a little bit more about Noah and how he represents the second Adam. So it looks like it is another circle that started with Noah. So the first circle of the civilization started with Adam, and the second one with Noah. But now let us go directly to the first verse of the Bible. And we probably can spend 1 hour or even more just discussing this first verse of the Bible, because it provokes a lot of discussion among the scholars about the specific meaning of this verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It is actually not only one verse, but two first verses of the Bible. And the first question that the scholars very often ask is how to translate properly this first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Or another variant, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. So in this case, do you see they entered one word, and this word is when. In the beginning, when God created the earth, heaven and earth, the earth was formless and void. And in this case, it is like a temporal clause, and the main clause in verse number 2. And now it is one way how we can translate it. The verse 1 is the temporal clause subordinated to the main clause in verse 2. So this is the one way how we can translate it. Another way how it is also possible to translate. Okay, let me. Yeah, it is possible also to say that the first verse is a temporal clause which is subordinated to the main verse, which is in verse number 3. Let me read it for you in this interpretation. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, and after that it's like a parenthesis, because second verse was like a parenthesis, like insertion, and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the surface of the water deeps, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. And God said, so when the God created the heaven and the earth, and verse 3 is the main clause. So, but before we start discussing the meaning of these translations, I would like to explain how the scholars come to the conclusion that it is possible to translate verse number 1 as a temporal clause. Let me open for you just the concordance. Any other? So this is the Hebrew text. Can you see it or not? Oh, I didn't show it to you, sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, Prof.
Yes, Prof.
In this case, in order to translate it in such a way to make it a temporal clause, we need to put different vowels to the verb bara. So actually, the scholars assume that this, just imagine that there is no vowels here. So we have only the consonants. Bereshit, bara, Elohim. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. So Bereshit, they understand the word bara is like an infinitive construct, not as a perfect or katal as we have it here, according to the vowels given by the Masoretes. But they say that it is also possible to present as an infinitive construct, like bero or bera, something like this. And in this case, they say that the noun reshit, which means beginning, also should be in the form of the construct form. So in this case, if bara is not a verb, but it is, it is a verb, but if it is not a perfect or it's not katal, but if it is an infinitive construct, so we can translate it as a gerund in English. And it will be like this: in the beginning of creation of God, heaven and earth. In the beginning of the creation of earth, by God, heaven and earth, the earth was tohu vavohu, which means empty and formless, and so on and so forth. So, and in this case, if you translate the first verse like this, So of course we can provide this word when. So in the beginning, when God created the heaven and the earth was empty and formless. So what is the theological implication of this translation? This translation implies a kind of how to say, a gap between verse number 2 and verse number 3. In the beginning, when God created the heaven and the earth was empty and void. Yes, Pastor Dion.
Professor, another thing that I'm just seeing, that if you then see it that way, which I think it seems to be logically correct, is to say that the beginning is not the creation of the sphere of the earth, because the creation then is the organization of the sphere. So it means that in the beginning, when the creation started, the sphere was already there, but it was void and was dark. So the creation in itself is not the creation of the sphere; it's the organization and the creation on top of the sphere.
Yes.
And that to me is more logical.
Yes, and one more theological implication that we have when we agree with this translation is, do you see how it sounds? In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth. So it's not an absolute creation, but it is just in the beginning of creation, in the beginning of creation. So, but I need to tell you that actually most of the scholars, I of course I cannot say most of the scholars, but as you see in many translations, they do not reflect this understanding of the first verse, and there are some grammatical issues. First of all, it's very difficult, so it's not clear that the word bara is infinitive construct. So it could be infinitive construct, but it is not likely. And it is also not likely that the word bereshit is also infinitive construct. So that is why today many scholars do not agree with this interpretation, and they just stick to the traditional interpretation that the first clause is just a normal clause, normal sentence. It is not a temporal clause depending on the main sentence in verse number 2. So in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth, and the earth was empty and void. Yeah, this is the most traditional and the most natural way of reading the verse number 1.
Prof, may I just ask just a simple thing that will probably answer very quickly. Bereshit does not have a Reshit. There's no article ha.
Yes.
Before Reshit when it says in the beginning.
So that is why.
Is there any significance to that? I'm asking because I heard in a video someone make a big deal out of that. So I just wanted to know.
Yeah.
Because he concluded that it should be actually translated in beginning. God created heaven and earth instead of in the beginning.
In beginning. So,
yeah.
Do you see the issue of the article is important here? Why? Because if it is a construct chain, so let me go back to the Hebrew. So if you remember from the Hebrew grammar class, if you have a construct chain, Reshit is a construct state. So the construct state never can take an article. Okay, For example, if I say, so what is the son of a king? Yeah, son of a king. Ben Hamelech. I cannot say Ha Ben Hamelech. So always the main word, or the word which is in absolute state, can take an article. The word which is in the construct state cannot take an article, the article. So in this case, they can say that the absence of the article in the word Bereshit is a kind of an indication that we need to translate Reshit as a construct state. Do you understand? Yeah. So in a beginning of God's creation. But on the other hand, so do you see we have, it's also a matter of how we can vocalize the text, because here, as you see, the Masoretes vocalize it, and Reshit is without definite article. But in order to add a definite article, we don't need to change the word. We just need to add patach here, and we will have in the beginning, Bereshit. Do you understand? So if the preposition is added to the word, in this case, if the word has an article, so the article disappears and only the vowel remains from the article. So do you remember this?
Yes.
So this is also the matter of how we can vocalize the text. But the most important issue, as for me, is that the word bara, to present it as an infinitive construct, is not very likely. So it's just like making it a little bit awkward, because of course we have some this kind of infinitive construct, like for example, Book of Ruth. Yes. Vayhi bime shefot ha shofetim. So here we have a similar construction. I wouldn't say that this construction is identical, but a little bit we can find some similarities. So the word shefot here is infinitive construct, and here we can translate it like this: and it was bime, in the days of judging. Do you see? Here we translate it as a gerund, or how do you call it in English? In the days of judging of judges.
The judges.
Yes. Or we can translate it as a temporal clause. And it was when the judges judged. Yes? As a temporal clause. Okay, let's go back to Genesis.
Professor?
Yes.
If you make it a temporal clause, the impact is quite big in terms of to say when was the globe created, because on the one side, if it's not a temporal clause, we're saying the Earth as a globe was created 6,000 years ago. But if it's a temporal clause, then it says that the Earth was maybe created much older, but the organization and the creation that God did on the Earth started 6,000 years ago, and there's a big impact.
Yes, there is a big impact, and but actually we go to this idea a little bit later, and we don't need to have it as a temporal clause to say like this, but we have another arguments that can allow us saying like this about the gap between verse 2 and verse 3. But we will speak about the gap theory a little bit later. So now, do you see? Let us remember the pattern in the Book of Ruth. Elohim here without article. And this is also an issue here, because in the book of Ruth, Hashofetim, it was an article here, and in this case we can say that it is a construct chain. Vayhi bime shefot hashofetim, and it was in the days of judging of the judges. Of course, somebody can say that the word Elohim is definite by itself, so it doesn't need article. But sometimes Elohim is used with the article as well. So that is why I want to tell you that it is a debatable issue. And there are some scholars who argue for the temporal clause here. Some scholars who argue, no, it is not a temporal clause, so we need to translate it as a sentence here, as a full sentence here. In the beginning, God created. And this translation, in the beginning God created, is the most natural translation, because it gives us, it's traditional one, and it is most natural in the sense that the bara is better to present as a katal, as a perfect, but not as an infinitive construct. Okay, so let me go back to our presentation. I just wanted to tell you different ways how different scholars try to interpret this first clause or the first sentence from the Bible. So do you see the first who proposed this was Ibn Ezra. It means it was a long time ago in the Middle Ages. So he said that Bereshit should be infinitive, just construct state, and the word bara should be in infinitive construct. But as I told you, it is unlikely. Yes, and the theological implication in the beginning of creation of heaven and earth, the earth was empty and void. So it doesn't tell us that God is the creator of heaven and earth. So, but maybe not. Maybe in the beginning of God's creation, the heaven and earth was empty. So do you see, there are so many different ideas that could be involved here, and it's very difficult to explain them in all the details. But another issue that I would like to emphasize here, and this idea also has some theological implementation. And this idea is that we can understand this phrase, heaven and earth, as a merism. So what does the word merism mean? It is a literature device when it explains a whole by taking the opposites. Like, for example, young and old. So what do we mean when we say young and old?
Everyone.
Everyone, yes, correct. Or for example, if we say day and night, what do we mean?
All the time.
All the time, yes, all the time. So do you see, merism means that we can take two opposite issues, like young and old, day and night. And by combining it with the conjunction and, we want to explain everything. So everything which is between young and old, everything which is between day and night. So everything. In this case, if we consider the heaven and the earth as a merism, so what does it mean? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So how shall we understand heaven and earth?
God created everything?
Yes, correct. So in the beginning, God created everything. So this is one of the ideas that could be also under this phrase, or in the meaning of this phrase. But what can be against this idea is the fact that in the second verse, what we have, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, everything, but the earth was tohu vavohu, empty and void. And when we said in this case that the earth was, do you see, in this case, it looks like the author divides heaven and earth, and he begins to speak only about the earth. And if he speaks only about the earth, maybe it doesn't mean that heaven and earth means everything. But sometimes people say that the first verse is like a title or like a summary of everything that is written later on. So in the beginning, God created everything. And after that, there is a description how God created everything. So I just want to tell you that there are so many ideas behind these verses, and there are so many interpretations that were suggested by the scholars. Yes, and this Genesis 1:1 as an initial creation. The adherents of this theory translate the second verse like, and the earth became formless and void. And this is, we have it as gap theory. And there are two gap theories. One theory is called like an active gap theory, and another theory is called passive gap theory. So they imply that there was a, there was a gap. And the active gap theory says that there was a gap between verse number 1 and the verse number 2. And they based this understanding on the translation of the Hebrew verb chaya, to be. And the Hebrew verb chaya could be translated in two ways. It could be translated as it was, as it is translated in most of the translations, and it could be translated as become or became. And as I said, both translations are equally possible. So what this active gap theory implies? So Genesis 1:1 is an initial creation. So God created heaven and earth. But verse number 2 says, but the earth became formless and void. And we need to tell a little bit more about this expression tohu vavohu, or tohu vabohu. Sometimes people say, scholars say, that this expression tohu vavohu is related to myth about Babylonian myth about creation, and they somehow tried to equate tohu vavohu with the goddess Tiamat, and this was a Babylonian goddess of the ocean, and this is a personification of primordial chaos. So they want to say that this phrase tohu vavohu means actually that expression of chaos. So the land became in the state of chaos. And in this case, they translated and they understand it like this. So God created heaven and earth, but the earth and everything was okay, everything was good in the initial God creation, because everything that God created was good by default. But earth became tohu vavohu, so it means that earth became now in the state, acquired the state of chaos. So it was transformed in the chaotic state. And so they ask themselves, so why did it happen that the initial creation of God was transformed in this chaotic state? And they explained like this. that the Saturn came to this earth, so it was a gap. And they said it was an active gap between verse 1 and verse 2. That in the beginning God created everything, created earth, and everything was okay. But because Saturn came to this world, came to this earth, he made everything into chaos. So this is the initial creation, and after that Saturn came down and earth became a house. And after that God started the week of creation, the week of creation. So this theory is called active gap theory. But of course, this theory doesn't have enough support in the scriptures. So we cannot find anywhere in the scripture that there was initial creation, and after that Saturn came on this earth and he messed up everything, and God had to create again. Okay, so there is a question. Yeah, Pastor Dion.
Yes, Professor. It's just about a little bit later when we learn about the firmament, that God made the difference between the land and the atmosphere, and the firmament, as it's called, and He called the firmament heaven. So it says that in the creation week, the firmament was created. So therefore, when we look at the verse 1.1, verse 1, for me, it says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then later he starts to talk about how he created the firmament and call it heaven. So for me, this whole active gap thing doesn't work. Because in the verse 1 already talks about the firmament and heaven as a heaven, and then he explains later how he called the firmament heaven. So this active gap doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. Yes. It doesn't make sense also because we don't have any other verses in the Bible that would say about this active gap and about Satan who came down in between verse 1 and verse 2. So actually, this is just nonsense, but there are somebody who still believes in it, but I don't know many people who believe in this. And what also we can say is actually tohu vavohu cannot be translated as a primordial house, because God doesn't create house. And this is a description of the earth before the week of creation. And it's better to translate it as without form and void. We also can find the same phrase tohu vavohu in the book of Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 23, when he says, "I looked on earth and behold it was without form and void, and to the heavens and they had no light." The description of the land after it is contaminated with the sin of the people of Israel. And we will speak about this idea a little bit later. We will speak about this when we speak about the flood. And we will see that actually the sin is something that reverses the creation. When people committed sin, so it brings back to the state before the creation. So it is better to say that this phrase tohu vavohu means the state of the earth before the creation. And now we can come to another theory, and this is called passive gap theory. And this passive gap theory actually says that there was a gap, but it was between verse number 2 and verse number 3. So in this case, these two verses, first and second, are the background, are the description. These verses are the description of the background event. The first verse of Genesis briefly records the creation of the universe and its essential form, and the second verse singles out a part of the universe, the earth, and describes its condition in some details. And as I said, this is the passive gap theory that says that there is a gap between verse number 2 and verse number 3. And now I would like to pay your attention to this passive gap theory. Why? Because if you remember, about 6 years ago, I don't remember exactly, or 7 years ago, we had Sabbath School quarterly on creation.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and this passive gap theory was promoted in this Sabbath School quarterly. And I don't know about your place, but in my place, there was a lot of discussion among the church members, and some people didn't want to accept this theory. Some people accepted, so it was a kind of controversy. And so now I don't stand on the position to accept or not to accept this idea of the passive gap theory, but I would like to explain to you why some of the Adventist scholars believe in this passive gap theory. By the way, if you read the commentary written by Jacques Ducan, it is our Adventist commentary, you will see that he actually supports this idea of passive gap theory. So in order to understand it, we need again go back to the Hebrew grammar. Okay, I don't have it here in my presentation because do you see it's easy to speak to you because most of you took Hebrew grammar and you can understand what I'm speaking about. So and now I would like to pay your attention to the form of the verbs that are used in this narrative. So let me go back to Hebrew text. So Bereshit bara. So what is the form of the bara? What is this? Yiktol, katal, vayiktol, or anything else?
Katal?
Katal, correct. Second verse, haita. It's another verb, haita. What the form is this?
Katal?
Pardon?
Katal?
Katal, yes, it's also katal. V'haaretz haita tohu vavohu v'choshek al penei tachom v'ruach Elohim merachefet al penei chamayim. So this is the only verb that occurs here, and this is haita. We also have this merachefet, and this is a participle. Mem says that this is a participle. But it is not a full verb. Yes, so we have in the verse number 2 and verse number 1 we have only katal verbs. So what about verse number 3? Vayomer Elohim.
Vayiktol?
Yes, correct. This is vayiktol. This is vayiktol. This is Vayiktol. And I would like to refer you to the book of Alviero Nikachi, the syntax of the Hebrew verbs, something like this. I can share this book with you. It is a very nice, introduction to Hebrew syntax, especially the narrative syntax. And he mentioned one very interesting pattern in the Bible. So when we have the narrative, which starts with the katal, So in this case, and after that we have vayiktol, like here we have vayiktol, vayomer. So in this case, the sentence that have katal describes a background event. So it means the event that happened before the vayiktol action started. So if we speak in the terms of Hebrew, or sorry, in the terms of English grammar, in this case, we need to translate bara as plus one, it's a Greek, as a past perfect tense. Okay. I will give you an example which is which is clear. Let's go to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. So it describes the story of Joseph, and look at the pattern. The Yosef, Horat, and Horat is also perfect. Hofal, perfect. It is Katal. The Yosef, Horat, Mitzrayma, Vayikenehu, Potiphar. So do you see here, the first phrase, this one, is also used as a katal. The katal form is used here. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, if you translate it correctly. And after that, we have Vayikto. And Potiphar bought him. Okay? And second verse also, Vayikto. Vayhi Adonai at Joseph. And the Lord was with Joseph, or Joseph. But when we look at chapter 37, in the end of the chapter 37, we can see that here the Madianites sold him to Egypt. Le Potiphar, Seris, it's an officer or eunuch of Pharaoh. So do you see what we have here? We have chapter 38 is inserted here, and here we have the description that actually it's already happened. Joseph was already sold to Potiphar, okay, by the Madianites. And when we come to the chapter 38, it actually, the first clause repeats what was said in the last sentence of the chapter 37. And it is like a background, it's like a background event. And after that starts the chain of Vayiktos. The Vayiktos chains starts, okay? So in this case, we can say that the action that is described by Katal is action that started or took place before the action that described with Vayikto started.
Professor?
Yes.
I just want to confirm that is it. If we take that same structure, we can say that in verse 7 and verse 8, it says, "And God made the firmament, and He called it heaven." And if we go back to verse 1, it says, "And God made the heaven and the earth." So it's the first time that He actually called something heaven was in verse 7, which is part of the creation. And that's what you were saying, that the first part in the beginning, God created that heaven and the earth, and then he talks about how it was created. So for me, the first verse is saying this is what He's done, and then he goes on to say the details of that. Because you can't refer in verse 1.1, it is to say you could have said in the beginning God created man. And then it only later talks about when man was created. We then know that man wasn't there before because he only created it in verse 7 and 8. That I don't know if that makes sense, Professor.
No. Just let me finish first, and I will explain everything, and later on we can ask questions. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. So do you see? And Alvaro Nicace gives some more examples in his book when this syntax occurs. For example, when we have the chain of Weichtels, and starting from verse 3, we have this chain of Weichtels. And God said, and God saw, and God called, and God said again. So we have everything here, the chain of Weichtels. Weichtel, Weichtel, Weichtel. And the chain of Weichtels tells us that this is a sequence of the events. And those events are sequential. So one follows another. But what happened in the beginning, so which was described with the katal or perfect form of the verb, this happened before the chain of Weichtels started. So this is event that happened before then the event that is described by Weichtels. And the story of Joseph is an example. Like, for example, in the first verse, it says that Joseph was sold to Potiphar. And this is the event that happened before. And after that, there is a story. And God was with him, and the chain of Weichtels starts. So is it clear?
Makes sense, Prof.
Okay. So in this case, this theory is called passive gap theory. Why it is called passive gap theory? Because it actually, according to the grammar, we can say that the event described in verse 1 and verse 2 preceded the chain of events started in verse 3. But the grammar doesn't tell us how much time was between verse 2 and verse 3. Okay? So it just tells that it could be a gap between 2 and 3, verse 2 and 3. But how long was the gap? We do not know. It could be like million years, or it could be just 1 second. We do not know. That is why this theory is called passive gap theory, which tells us that the gap is possible, but nobody knows how long was this gap. Okay, it's clear? And most of our Adventist theologians, especially in Addus, they believe that it is really like this. So that in the beginning, God created the earth, or heaven, the earth. And as I told you, there is a question, how shall we understand this phrase, heaven and earth? We can understand it as the creation of everything, the creation of the universe. But the earth was tohu vavohu, which means it was empty and void. And it was like it was created, but it was not populated. So it was just in this state for a period of time. And after that, in one moment, God decided to populate. Or Pastor Dion, you said a very good expression. I don't remember how you said it. To organize, or to organize the creation, or to create means. So in this case, the week of creation started in verse 3. And verses 1 and 2 describe the creation that is like a background event. So something that happened before the events described in verse number 3. So is it clear?
Makes sense.
Okay, but actually, what I always say when I explain everything, I say that actually it is not an important issue for us. So this is not the issue why we should have like a battle, theological battle, or whatever. So, and if church members do not believe in the passive gap, and they say there was no gap, But the entire chapter from verse 1 to the last verse describes the process of creation. It's okay. If somebody believes that there was a passive gap, it's also okay, no problem with that. So we don't need, so the main thing that is, we shouldn't make a division because in the church, because of this not very important issue. Because even the passive gap theory says that even if the gap exists, we do not know how long it was. So it could be like no gap at all, or it could be a gap, we do not know. Okay, so is it clear?
Yes, yes. Sir.
Now,
Yes,
please,
Professor.
if you have any questions, so I will try to answer them. No questions so far?
Yeah, I wanted to just summarize something so that it can be clear in my mind. So there's the understanding that verse 1 is basically a summary of everything that takes place afterwards.
Yes.
In chapter 1. Or that verse 1 and 2 provide the background of how things were before the creation week started.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes,
I don't know. I don't know because Ellen White does not. I'm just saying this one to talk about what you're saying in the what you call it as what, because I remember in the church I was at that time, I was in the United States, and this was a big contentious issue even there. Yeah, but from what we have, it's clear that the earth was without form and void before the creation of the world. That one is clear. But how verse 1 fits into that, that's where the
so
issue.
the question is, shall we include first two verses into the first day of the creation? And our Adventist theologians say, no, we cannot do this. Because it is clear that the first day of creation starts from the verse 3, and it ends in verse 4 or 5. Yes, and we cannot include these two verses into the first day. So that is why they say that according to Hebrew grammar, it is clear that there was a kind of a gap between second and third verses. But that is why they call it the passive gap, because we do not know exactly how long this gap was lasted. Okay.
Right, so the state of being without form and void is not exactly a state of chaos.
No. Yes. This is important issue. Yes. We cannot say that tohu vavohu is the state of chaos, because many, especially liberal theologians, they say that it is a state of chaos. But actually, everything that God created, it couldn't be in the state. God doesn't create chaos. He everything that He creates with the purpose. So it should be orderly, organized. So that is why we cannot say that this phrase tohu vavohu means house. And tomorrow we will speak what it means actually. So why it is said like this. And we also will see later on, especially when we will speak about the flood, and we will see that the flood actually is the reversal of the creation. And when flood happens, actually, what happens during the flood? So the earth was brought to the condition which it had before the creation. Okay, so do you see when? So what was before the creation? There was no dry land at all. Everything was covered with the water. So what happened during the flood? Again, for 1 year, or just maybe a little bit shorter than 1 year, the water covered all the surface of the earth, and there was no dry land. So it was like a state before the creation. So sin actually brings reverse the order. And the same idea we can find in the book of Jeremiah, when Jeremiah says about the state of the land in his time. And of course, he speaks about the sins of the people. He says, I look at the earth and he is empty and void. And he uses the same phrase as is in the book of Genesis. So it means that the sin of the people bring the land in the condition like it was before the week of creation. Okay, so I see some people raised hands. So if you have anything to add.
Quickly, Prof, just in what you said, this thing of sin bringing the earth into its state before creation, it seems like a theme that is repeated over and over in the Bible. For example, in the book of Zephaniah, you see the same thing when God says, I will utterly consume all things. It's in chapter 1, verse 2. From off the land, says the Lord, I will consume man and beast. I will consume the fowls of heaven and the fishes of the sea, and stumbling blocks with the wicked. So if you look at verse 3, it talks about consuming man and beast, which took place on the 6th day. And then it talks about consuming the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, which takes place in the 5th day. So it's almost like God is doing a work of reversing the work of creation in the destruction that he brings. Something similar you see towards the end of the Bible when the earth is described as a bottomless pit. And the word that is used, translated bottomless pit in the English versions, is the same as the word that is used in the Septuagint that describes the verse that you referred to in Tohu Vavohu in Jeremiah, and also in the book of Genesis. So it seems like it's a consistent theme that culminates in the destruction of the earth at the second coming of Christ and during the millennium.
Thank you very much for your observation. Thank you. Yeah, it's really true. Yeah. Pastor Dion, I saw you also raised cap long ago.
Yes, Professor. It's just coming to the first verse where it says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," and it is about the two ways that one can look at it. In the one way that you mentioned, that heaven and the earth means that He created everything. So that's the one way of looking at it. The other way that one can look at it, and that is, which says He created the heaven and the earth. Now, that is to say that he created the organization, because it only refers to heaven, and the first time where heaven is called heaven is in verse 7 and verse 8. So verse 1 should, according to myself, should not be read together with verse 2. Verse 1 should say, "In the beginning, God created the organization, which is everything heaven and earth organized," and then it says. Verse 2 is now saying that this is how it happened, that in the beginning it was formless and void, and then he created the organization. So for me, the fact that he included heaven in that first verse and only says in verse 7, he only there for the first time called it heaven, that means that it talks about not the creation of the sphere, it talks about the organization that happened in that first week. It's not that he created all the spheres in the whole universe. That's just my interpretation of it, Professor.
Okay. So the only thing, let us go back to verse 7. Vayikra Elohim l'Rekia Shamayim in verse 8. Yes, he called Shamayim. So you're right. The only thing I would like to add is that we cannot say about the week of creation as a week of organization of everything. Do you see? Because actually during the week of creation, God created things, and he created it by his word. So
the organization is not the right word. No, organization is, but it was organized after his creation.
It was created, and it was like So sometimes people say that in the beginning, I agree with you that we can understand the first verse as God created the universe or God created everything. It's also possible. And he also created the earth, but the earth was not populated. It was just not without form, without inhabitants, just empty. And in the week of creation, he started this process of modifying the earth and bringing it to the condition that it should have according to his plan. Okay. So I can agree with you, but I just cannot agree with the word organization. So we can pick up
I
another
agree.
word.
Yeah.
Okay, Pastor Landiela, I can see that you raised up your hand.
Yes, Prof. I am assimilating the concept of passive gap. And my question, Prof, is how can we avoid the how can you say it? How can we avoid the pitfall of the evolutionists when you know when we say that God created the earth and then there was a gap. We don't know how long was it, because you know I am thinking about the the position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I think it was in 2010 that we adopted the the concept of seven days creation.
6
So
days.
how yeah 6 days of creation. So how can we defend the I'm trying to find more arguments to I want to be solidly based on this concept.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So let us talk about the evolution or questions related to the evolution a little bit later when we finish the week of creation. And we need to mention something about the evolution, because there are so many ideas now about how to reconcile the account of the creation with the theory of evolution. And as I understand, most of those theories just do not work, because in most of the cases, they represent God as somebody who uses the evolution. And there are many, many other issues are raised, like, for example, death, because actually the creation and evolution cannot be reconciled at all. Evolution says about the death, a natural process. And we can see that death appeared only after the fall. So we cannot incorporate death in the process of creation. And many, many other issues like this. So let us speak about it later. Yes, and I understand your concern, because do you see many people, especially when we have this Sabbath School quarterly, they also they didn't accept this passive gap theory because they were afraid. They were afraid of compromise with the theory of evolution. So they say, if we assume that Earth was created many, many, many years ago, like millions or billions years ago, so in this case, we can just try to we just give way to the evolution ideas to penetrate into our teaching. But as I told you, actually, yes, according to the grammar, we can say about the gap, but we can say nothing about the time period or how long the gap lasted. So we cannot say anything about that. So that is why I do not see here any problems with the evolution. So nobody tries to reconcile the account of creation with the theory of evolution. Yeah, according to the grammar, it is possible. And I would like to emphasize once again, so the main point is to not make a division in the church because of these issues. So we need to keep our church united, not divided.
Amen.
because of these minor issues that actually do not affect anything else in our understanding of God and his salvation history. Yeah, anything else?
Yes, so Prof, I had my hand up just quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I think in addition to what you are saying, this passive gap theory does not say that during that time of a gap, even if it was a day
The evolution
or
happened.
whatever,
No.
evolution happened to where we are
no,
on Earth.
no.
So
No
everything that
evolution.
we know as existing today on Earth happened during the 6 days of creation.
Yes.
And the sun and the moon and the stars, all of those things happen within that week of creation. And it is clear, according to verse 2, there was an earth that was without form and void before creation week. When it was there, the Bible does not tell us. And how it got there, the Bible does not tell us. So I think we also need to make sure that whatever we explain, we leave unexplained what God has not explained. I think sometimes the difficulty comes when we try to fill in the gaps or to say things that the Bible has not said.
Mm-hmm.
Ours is to say what is said and to leave unsaid what God has left unsaid.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Anything else? Anybody else?
Yes.
Please.
I'm trying to internalize and try to incorporate what you are saying concerning the passive gap theory, but it is forcing my nervous, especially when I try to think whether it's clumping and applying the divine and truth of the word. When it brings passiveness in the minds of the lay people. But for the scholars, it's okay, we can argue, but in terms of divinity, then, of the lay people, I think we cannot imply it in anymore.
Okay, yes. Pastor Karani, as I told you, as I told all of you, that the main important issue is not to make a division in the church. Yes, and if somebody doesn't accept it, no problem with it. And I see that you as pastors, you should know, and you should know how to explain it. And you should know all those details about the understanding of the week of creation. But if you see that it can produce some division in the church, it is better not to tell anything, or it's better to avoid this rather than explain it to the church and make some kind of division. So just be careful. Be careful, because we can find some other issues, and we will speak about it later on. About, for example, we can speak about the sin of Ham, and I try to avoid speaking about this in the church because I understand it can provide it can provoke some division in the church. So I don't want to do this. So you should know much more than the lay church members know. But it doesn't mean that you should always speak about this in the church. So be very careful, okay? If in your church there is an understanding that the first 2 verses of book of Genesis can be incorporated in the first day of creation, and everything is happy without this, so maybe it doesn't make sense to explain to them that actually it was not like this, and we need to separate it, and it can provoke many other issues in the minds of the church members. So we have to be very careful with this. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Now,